about this, and it was the FBI was using the mafia model to root out terrorism, so-called terrorism, in the immigrant Muslim community. And that model was like follow the money. And they really assumed, they had this assumption that all of our institutions, our charities, etc., were just like fronts. And so that was the way that they could infiltrate, the way they could get into the communities, the way they could justify having a criminal investigation, because there were no crimes. You know, like there were actually no crimes they were investigating. The premise for this was to find something, right? And so they used these white-collar crimes as a justification within the Department of Justice to even begin these criminal investigations. And when they didn't find any terrorism, they just, you know, used these, like they just indicted people on these like really petty crimes. And that happened, by the way, all over the country. So what, you know, the brother mentioned that this is not just in Chicago, not at all. I mean, just in the FBI documents that we found that it was happening in dozens of cities across the country, places where there were American Muslim, like large American Muslim communities, and very similar things were happening. They were investigating the charities. They were charging people with, you know, very petty crimes, white-collar crimes as well. So this was like a model that was used all over the country in the 90s. And it was, so it's like, you know, people think like, oh, the war on terror started after 9/11. Like, no, decades before this had started.
How you had the whole, the historical 1917 black, just investigating black people, 1930 Japanese, World War II.
Puerto Rican American community, Native American community, COINTELPRO. And it's really, there's something in seeing that there, you know, that the FBI has been doing this historically for a really long time. And even if you read the COINTELPRO documents, they're fully unredacted now. COINTELPRO was the FBI investigation that targeted the Black Power and Civil Rights movement in the 50s and 60s, put surveillance on Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, etc. And when you read those records, like the most stunning thing is seeing the why. And that's what's redacted in my documents, why they did this, right? And the why was to disrupt the activities of the Black Power movement, right? To disrupt the organizing, because they saw this as a national security threat to white supremacy. And that was the reason, right? And so it was never about finding or stopping crime, never. And that's what I'm waiting to see in the vulgar betrayal file, but I assume, based on the historical record, that it would be similar, that this was never really about stopping crime or finding crime, but disrupting the organizing of the immigrant Muslim community that was starting to build institutions, that was starting to mobilize and become active. And that was what it did. You know, it had a huge chilling effect on our organizing, had a huge chilling effect on raising money and donations, for our causes, etc. So, yeah, it's not actually about stopping or finding any crimes or terrorism, it's about something else. And if you look at the historical record, all of that is in there, like in their own writing.
Thank you. We've got a question back here.
Hi, thank you for your film, thank you for coming out. One thing that we found locally here is the way that like introducing this counterterrorism frame into prosecution is allowing prosecutors, judges, investigators, and even local police departments to be able to, I think, add high-level aggravations to people's low-level misdemeanors and even low-level felonies and stuff like that. Also, the ways that regular prosecution in terms of low-level misdemeanors and felonies has been used as like a window to deepen that investigation. So say a certain person from a certain community is pulled in on an armed robbery charge or something like that, they will hold them while they're in detention and say go through their phone, look up their further contacts. Did you see anything like that in Chicago? And if so, what's the best means of kind of tracking how that happens, since it's sort of through the back door?
This is something that happened. This is one of the post 9/11 tactics that they were using. I didn't necessarily see that was something they were doing in the 90s, but yeah, this, after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, the minimum sentencing laws started with terrorism, so it's like 15 years, right? And so they add those on, they tack those on. That was Patriot Act that did that added a lot of those laws. But also, like the brother mentioned, you know, people get picked up on minor charges, and are churned in prison. If they have a Muslim name, they'll have FBI agents come to them and try to turn them into informants. And the whole informant thing is so problematic because they're often going after vulnerable people. You know, like it's people with people that are caught up in the criminal justice system. They're people with mental illness sometimes. They're people with extenuating circumstances, and they're taking these vulnerable folks and turning them into informants. And it's like they're also victims in this. It's hard to see that, but like throughout my process, I had a whole thread where I was looking for the informants and realized that actually like this is a part of the problematic thing. They also go to people that are not documented and try to turn them that way. That happened to my family. The FBI came to my house before the incident that my mom talks about, while my father was still alive, and asked my father, show us your papers. They had an INS, at the time it was INS, agent with the FBI agent at our door saying, show us your papers. And if you cooperate with us, we can make you citizens tomorrow. And if you don't, you're out. And so this is a kind of like ultimatum they present to a lot of people, and it's really difficult. But yeah, so I haven't seen all that much. Like a lot of this stuff happens quietly. You don't actually know about it until folks talk. There's an amazing program at CUNY. It's a law school in New York. It's called CUNY Clear, and they just work with informants that have been people that have been like manipulated to work with them, or vulnerable people that felt like they needed to do it, and informants can actually come to them and say, this is what happened. So we've only heard about these stories about being picked up on like low-level crimes and being approached in lockup to do certain things from these stories. And it's like the more of these stories we know about, the more we can document that. Otherwise, it's always happening in secrecy. But that's one of the amazing programs, CUNY Clear, that's doing this specific kind of work.
That reminds me of the last film that we saw during the film screening, Terror, when the subject of the film had been caught up in prison on some petty crime, and the FBI convinced him that in order to get like a lesser sentence or to be to actually get out of jail, that he would have to inform on other Muslims. And so he did that for over 30 years and put away and entrapped God knows how many people. And so it's really telling that the FBI go after desperate people and people in situations that they want to get out of. So a question over here.
Good evening. It's not necessarily a question, but a comment. So you stated that your weapon was your camera, and I just want to big up your mother in this equation, because as we saw in the film, when they see us, when that parental support doesn't happen, how it can derail the movement, right? And bring harm to your family or to your community. And so I really want to big up her role in this, because the power of parent support is strong in all of these movements where young people are risking their lives for the sake of the greater good of a community. And so when you talk about like what ways can we relate to this film, or what is the big takeaway, really as a parent, my takeaway is really how can we support young people in this work, and make sure that we support them and we love on them, and we not derail the progress, right, that is being made by young people. So big up to your mom.
Thank you for that. Such an instrumental part of this process. I probably never would have kept going if not for her. And from the very beginning, she was supportive, even when leaders in the community were like, why are you focusing on the negative things? Why don't you make a film about something positive? And, why don't you focus on the kids that graduated from the Islamic school that went to Ivy Leagues? And why don't you make a film about that? This idea of going into our negative past was really something that people didn't want to talk about, but it was still happening, and it was always the women who were the first to talk to me. So my mom, from the very beginning, literally took me by hand, and we went door to door in the neighborhood to her friends, where they had been having these private conversations about this experience, and encouraged folks to talk. And I think that it is actually something gendered, that women believed their intuition and their gut about what was going on and talked about it, while men that I interviewed consistently rationalized, like, yeah, I think it's happening, but you know, it's the law enforcement, this is what they do, or, but I have nothing to hide, so that's okay, or, you know, there were all these like layers of justifications, or like men were trying to rationalize it while women just believed their gut feeling. And big ups to all the women in the community who are organizers, who are doing this work, who supported it from the very beginning, even though they were scared. You know, even though they were scared, and that's like what courage is. Like, you're afraid, but you move anyway. You like move forward anyway. And there's such a model to all of us, and that support was everything. So yeah, that's even bigger than the camera, is like your mom. Yeah,
It's beautiful.
In the scene in the mosque with you and the law enforcement people, why did you black out some of the faces?
It was based on who signed release forms and who didn't. So we were filming that without trying to get permission from law enforcement to do it. And so since they did not consent, we had to make them anonymous. But it was such an important scene that it was like, yeah, despite not being able to see their faces, these are these closed room, closed door conversations that are happening between our community leadership and law enforcement that people in our community rarely get to see the inside of those rooms, and so it was really important to show. And so we could have just blurred them, or we thought we would use the redacted, we'd redact their faces like they redacted the documents. Poetic justice.
Oh, sorry. I have a comment and then I guess a question. So it's easy for a lot of us to think that this is history and it's not something that's happening here, or like, because there isn't a film, I guess that's exactly like that. That's like happening in Minnesota, but like it's happening here right now, especially to the Somali community, Muslim community here. And so I want you to please not think about this as a history, as a documentary, something that happens to other communities. It's happening right here. And then also it's being translated into policies, to bills, to money. There are politicians that we've elected that have endorsed these like dangerous policies and practices. And then, so I just wanted us to like rethink that. And then also my question is, something that I always hear is like, oh, if you have nothing to hide, then you don't have to be afraid of surveillance. If you're not a criminal, you don't have to be afraid of the law enforcement, or and so I don't know. I'm wondering if you have like a comment for that, or like what is? Can you talk about that? I guess.
Thank you for that. Yeah, this I got that a lot in my community too, right? Like, the community is not a monolith. There were people that were like, yes, this is messed up, and then there were people like, yeah, I welcome the FBI into my house because, you know, if I have nothing to hide, I have nothing to worry about. That statement, the principal fallacy in that statement is that innocence matters, and it doesn't. Depending on who you are, you have a hell of a lot to worry about, even if you have nothing to hide. And that's something we have to remember over and over again, that these are not about stopping crime. It's not about actually rooting out crime. It's profiling. So it doesn't matter whether you have something to hide or not. You should never let the FBI in your house. No shy for FBI. Consistently need to remember that. So, yeah, that's what I say to that it actually doesn't matter whether you have something to hide or not, that like, depending on what your identity is, you have a lot to worry about. And then on that comment that the surveillance is happening here right now, yeah, it definitely is. The way these investigations and operations happen is every few years they change the name of them. Countering Violent Extremism, CVE, is one of the ways it's manifesting right now in our communities. And this is still the same old surveillance with new names and new labels. And every few years they give it like a rebranding. But it's the same thing, and it's as old as this country, you know, this kind of surveillance of people of color. So, yeah, it's people can speak to that, like your experience. If you feel you're under surveillance, you probably are. That's another thing that a lot of these programs, I felt even while making the film, like I was gaslighted the entire time by the FBI, that we're told that like, oh, we're paranoid, you're crazy, this is not happening. And maybe one of the most important things of this film for my community was to validate their experiences, to say, yeah, like, this absolutely happened. It was actually worse than we thought. And so it's important to believe your experiences, to believe the experiences of your community, that this stuff is happening, and even if you don't have the evidence for it and you can't point to it necessarily, that like your feelings are valid, and especially when it's a collective experience, like that's very real. And like a big part of these investigations are meant to make us feel crazy, to make us feel so paranoid that we can't do anything about it, and also to systematically hide the evidence. Like, why do I have to still fight in court for something that happened 20 years ago? Because the power of these investigations is in the secrecy, and the government consistently tries to hide what they do. So yeah, you're not crazy.
Thank you for saying that. And you know, that reminds me, here in Minneapolis, there has been a huge surge of FBI informants that is targeting the Muslim and the Somali community. And for years, we've been talking about how that we're being surveilled, our phones are being tapped, that people are being visited by the FBI, and that they're specifically targeting the Somali community. And we've been gaslighted and told that you're paranoid and that you have nothing to be afraid about. And like, I think it was within like the last year, there was an FBI agent, an African-American FBI agent who actually is now serving, I think like 3 or 4 years in prison for releasing like secrets, where he basically was a whistleblower of the FBI, and he talked about the inhumane practices that are being used against the Somali community, and how he couldn't do his job because he felt like there was an ethical and moral dilemma. And even just like outside of like the policy and the strategy and the tactics that they have, he would hear these racist and Islamophobic and xenophobic comments around the office from his white FBI coworkers. And so it goes to show you that, you know, this isn't paranoia, right? And that people can gaslight us, but we know our gut and we know what's happening to our community. And we don't need, you know what I'm saying, the validation of the state to say, yes, we're surveilling you. We can call in history, and we can see with our own eyes the reality of the situation, right? Okay, and then we have a question here.
I wanted to also say thank you for coming after the film to allow us to ask you questions. And I thought it was an amazing film. And I'm wondering if you might answer how long it took you to make the film, and what were maybe some of the challenges, who you worked with, and maybe, you know, how you were able to fund this film for anybody in here who might be interested in doing a similar thing, because it's a really amazing piece of art, and thank you for doing it.
Thank you for that, I appreciate you. It was a 5-year-long process to make the film. It's my first film, so maybe it took that long because of that. But it also takes long to make documentary films. It was funded almost entirely by grants. I just applied to all the film grants. Ford Foundation was one of the big funders of this project as well. Islamic Scholarship Fund is one of the only Muslim funders for film project, so look up the ISF, Islamic Scholarship Fund. Yeah, so it was just like applying to a lot of grants. Some of them we applied to 5 times before we got it, and the grant cycles are like every year, so that's also why it took a little long. But my background is as a radio journalist, so for like 2 years I was making this film very much as a journalist, behind the camera, pointing the mic in people's faces, asking them questions that I already knew the answers to. And it took a real shift in my head, actually, that I had like internalized a lot of bullshit that about journalism specifically, and about this myth of objectivity, that like being far away from the subject makes you more like positioned to tell the truth about it, but that if you're a person that's experienced, or if you're really close, then you're clouded, you know. And it took me to unpack, a lot of time to unpack that, but 2 years in I realized, like, no, the most honest way to make this film is to make it personal, and also my motivations for making it were purely personal. And that even though it was probably the most painful and difficult thing I ever did was getting in front of the camera. I really did not want to do that. But it also was the beginning of a transformation for me. And I'm a totally different person now than I was starting it, and it was because I started making a personal film and unpacking why. And these things about, double consciousness, which is W.E.B. Du Bois, that you start to internalize the gaze of the other, the way other people see you, you start to believe it, right? These things, like all of these layers of things, all the shame I had in my community had internalized by being looked at as criminal for such a long time. It took, this like respectability politics that we were all engaging in, this whole trying to be a good Muslim, all those things, like making the film was a process of unpacking this stuff, and making a personal film was like the hardest thing I ever did, but very important, like personally. It was really difficult too. I started therapy for the first time in my life making this film. And I also started really thinking about trauma and healing. And that's what we're doing with the film now, actually. We're taking the film to 10 different communities, or American Muslim communities around the country, and we're doing free screenings. And we often talk about surveillance from a civil rights frame or from a legal frame. We rarely talk about trauma and healing. And what we want to do is have that conversation, talk about collective trauma. And so we have healers facilitating our post-screening conversations. We're actually coming back to Minnesota in the fall to have a free screening, and healers facilitate that conversation to start moving us towards, like, what does healing from something that is still happening to us look like? How have we internalized this trauma collectively and individually? How has it changed the way we move in the world? And I think like that's a conversation we don't have, especially in our immigrant Muslim communities. And it's a conversation that we really want to start. That this is beyond just violating our rights. This has collectively traumatized all of us, and we live with that trauma every day. And that's also, that's something I realized, and why I started therapy in the making of the film. That I was unpacking really deep things, and that if I needed healing, everybody in our community needed healing from this too. And so how do we start moving towards that? So that's where we are now.
Thank you.
Oh, hi, Salam. Thanks for coming to our community and showing this film.
Phone, if you put the phone far away from the mic, it'll help.
We're good?
If you stand away from where you are.
Yeah, I think that's a different location.
There we go. So one of the things that we've been... This is ridiculous.
You just talk real loud.
Yeah, I have a lot of voice. But one of the things that we've been dealing with, I think, on that point about healing has been when community sites become themselves sites of like surveillance. When mosques, schools, community centers, spaces are co-opted by like surveillance actors. For our own Muslim community in Minnesota, we've been having this like continual dialogue about accountability, responsibility, and how we move on from those kind of episodes. And so I was wondering, did you guys have, in Chicago and in other communities that you've been to, how have communities moved on from that, and how have they kind of continued to attempt to heal from this? Like when these things happen, especially I think in 2016, 14, and 15, mosques were a huge site where not only did they kind of coalesce and cooperate, they became active agents of surveillance themselves. And so a lot of people lost faith in these institutions, and a lot of youth felt like very much like they couldn't be safe there. And so as a result, mosque attendance dropped off drastically, and then we saw a lot of the domino effect of other things happen as a result of that. So how do communities heal from these kind of episodes of surveillance?
Thank you for that question. I think actually one of the most damaging effects of these surveillance investigations is that they transform our safe spaces, our spaces where we collectively gather, where we bring our families into places where we don't feel safe, where we don't trust to talk to anyone, and that's one of the most damaging effects of these investigations. But in October of last year, we had a free screening in Chicago for the Ridgeview Muslim community, and 500 people from the neighborhood and the community came out to this. And that was the actually first time we used that model of having healers as facilitators for the conversation after the screening. And it was really very powerful. People were really emotional. If you've experienced the surveillance, a lot of people in the room can relate. This is triggering also to watch this. It's bringing back a lot of the feelings that you've had, that you've experienced. And so, I think like the first step was just naming those feelings. I feel afraid, I feel, we had a centering, the healers did a centering practice in the beginning of talking about here's some language for what you might be feeling. And here's some things that you can do right now. If you're feeling like this is overwhelming and too much, you can step out, and we had healers set up in a space outside. But it was also we were thinking about it was based on somatics, soma, so that a lot of our trauma lives in our body. And when I say surveillance petrifies you, petrified means literally to be cast into stone. You're frozen by it. You don't move, you don't participate in things anymore, you don't show up. And so one of the ways we had healers move us through it was literally physical practices with the body. And that was really helpful. If you're feeling all of these feelings, how you can release them. What does it feel like to release? And so introducing just healing practices that we rarely talk about, therapeutic things that we rarely talk about in our communities, and giving people, practices that they could take home and engage in when they're feeling triggered, when they're feeling under surveillance, and that was really powerful. And I think another thing is that when these things happen to us in our communities, we're just okay, keep moving forward. We kind of bury it. We just need to get through. We need to get by. We have this survivor mentality of just moving forward, just keep going. And then these things are not dealt with, and they're kind of buried, and they live in our bodies, and they live in our heads, or they haven't gone away. We haven't released them. And so taking a moment to stop and say, this is really important for me, this is important for my family to go through this. This is not about rights. This is not just about rights, but this is also about how our relations, how these surveillance investigations have fractured our relations, our relationships with other people, our people in our community and in our family, the serious distrust that we have because of these, rightfully because of these investigations, and how to start unpacking some of it. Sometimes it's just pointing to it and naming it, and that's the first step. And we thought it was really important also because, therapy is stigmatized in our communities. It's a taboo thing. We don't really talk about it very much. It's only for crazy people. But bringing that back, saying no, this is really important, and it's important for, what we're going through right now. We've all been traumatized by this, and actually these conversations are not necessarily the mosque anymore. They're not places that have been infiltrated by informants and by agents. We have to create new spaces for that. There's a whole unmasking thing that's happening, in direct response to this. So the spaces where we're holding these healing conversations are not necessarily in mosques or even community organizations. They're spaces in the community but outside of that. And so that's really important. So we're just trying to start a process.
We'll take one last question here.
So my question for you is, how much do you think money has a role to play when it comes to this disenfranchisement and surveillance within Muslim communities? As someone who was part of the Occupy movement that saw one of the largest transfers of wealth from public funds to private institutions, that opened my eyes to the idea that every bad thing that has happened in American history can be traced back to that transfer of wealth from a large set of people to a smaller set of people. And I think the war on terrorism has been one of those things where I think Al-Qaeda spent $5 trillion. And so how much do you think money plays a role in that equation?
There's a great writer, his name is Trevor Ayers, who's written about this, and he says the reason for all of this is the FBI has to regularly justify their budget, and if they have less money one year, if they ask for, they have to consistently be pushing that up, and if they have, if they ask for less money one year, it'll continue to go down. So much of this, he says, his theory is about budgets. I think it's deeper than that. I don't think it's just white money. It's money. I think it's white supremacy. I think it's upholding a certain system in this country and looking at anybody who threatens that system, any group that threatens that system as a national security risk, and using words like terrorism and the new word extremism to justify the suppression of those communities. And extremism specifically has gotten like a lot of play now. It's like the new terrorists. You have the FBI investigation called against so-called Black identity extremists, which is targeting the Black Power movement, Black Lives Matter movement. Similar extremist investigation of the Standing Rock activists that is continuing to target them like more than a year after Standing Rock. So it's like, and then countering violent extremism. Again, you see that word extremism, so it's like the new terrorism that they're using. But yeah, I think that it's like money has something to do with it. We know that Islamophobia is a multi-billion-dollar industry. There are a lot of individuals that are profiting off of that. But in terms of government, yeah, like the FBI has to justify their budget every year, and they're getting a lot more money now with the so-called war on terror. But I think, it's older. I think it's deeper than that. I really think it's because it threatens, white supremacy, and that's why they come down really hard. And I've seen, like, historically, the moment that the FBI really comes down with all of their weight and force against communities is when communities of color start engaging in politics that is considered a national security risk, and that's like anything that threatens white supremacy. When those two things happen is when the weight of the federal government lands on communities, and we've seen that happen over and over and over again. So yeah.
Thank you for that response. And to contextualize it even further to Minneapolis, with the CB industry that we have going on here, the way that they were able to divide the community and have organizations sign up to willingly surveil their clients or customers and community members was that because there was such a need for these programs, right? These mental health services, these after-school programs, these healthcare programs, all these different things that the community, any community, should have these programs, right? Without first being, without this assumption of inherent violence, right, coming from this community. And so money plays a large part because I really don't think a lot of a lot of the actors that were involved, be it politicians, right, be it organizations like Kajog, would have taken this money, would have been a part of this program if there wasn't a financial incentive, right? If there wasn't some sort of benefit in that way. And so I really do think that money has been a really powerful tool by the state in order to divide communities that are already poor and that are already vulnerable to this type of entrapment in that way, right? So I would like to first off give a giant round of applause to Assia. And we're all excited to have you back, inshallah, at the end of this year. And I'm sure that everyone in this room will come again and have that experience. But we need to protect and support and uplift people and organizers and women like Assia who are showing and sharing these stories that otherwise would not be out there, right? And she has actually inspired us to do our own project, and in the meantime, right, because a lot of what you said earlier is these programs they thrive in secrecy and fear and shame and people being afraid, right, of being labeled as an extremist, right? And so it's really important that it's not just 3 or 4 people or 1 or 2 people. They're always on the front line defending our community, that instead it's all of us, right, standing next to each other. And that's how we protect ourselves, right? They can't come after all of us, right? So we all need to get together in that way. One thing I did want to say that I totally forgot was we have these hashtags behind me, hashtag See Me Not CBE, as well as the Unmasking Surveillance Series 2019. We did our film earlier in February. This is our second one, and we're hoping to do another one by the end of the year. And we also have a text line. If you text yes, if you text yes to 612-200-2550, we can update you on the different things that are going on around CARE and around the community. And you can also check out the website, see the projects that we're working on, as well as donate and support the work that we're doing. And so I'm going to give Assia, any final words or, parting words of wisdom or, something that you want to share with this community.
I feel like I talked a lot. You guys are sick of my voice after an hour and a half of movie in this. But I would just say that we are powerful, that we sometimes internalize a lot of cynicism when we start to believe what they say about us, that we don't have power, that we are powerless, that we are marginalized. But it's important to remember that we have power, and one of the ways, one of the things I talk about in the film is this idea of citizen undersight. There's government oversight and there's citizen undersight, that we have the power to watch back. And while they're watching us, and maybe there's nothing we can do about that, we still have the power to hold them to account, and to document what they're doing, and to talk back to it, and to say, we see you watching us, we're watching you watch us. And so when surveillance makes you feel really small and powerless, remember that we have power in community, that we should be building power and not paranoia, and moving forward, even despite our paranoia, despite our fears, that we should still be moving forward, that the strongest thing we have is our community, and this surveillance is meant to fracture us from each other, to make us distrust each other, and to break up community. And the most powerful, like the opposite of the panopticon is we're all divided, right? We can't see each other, and they can only watch us. The opposite of the panopticon is us looking around and seeing each other and looking back at the watchers. And we all have the power to do that. With our phones, when we record these events, the FBI shows up to your house, everyone says, don't talk to them, you can pull out your phone and film them too. There's a lot of power that we have, and most of it is in community. So don't forget your power, I would say. That you have it, tap into it, don't believe what they say about us being powerless.
And thank all of you for joining us tonight. We're so happy to have you, and we hope that you walk away feeling empowered to act and to organize. That's our greatest hope, right? That we're not afraid, that we're organizing. If you have the surveys and hold on, I almost forgot. We have the video thing that we're doing over here, our video series, as well as photos. So if you are interested, please head over. We will be here until as we're wrapping up. And we have a sign-up sheet, right? I know not everybody here got to sign in, so please sign up. We want to give you more. We want to make sure that you're plugged in. We're glad you came to this event. We have way more. We're doing a lot. We want you to be a part of our movement, so please sign up so that we can get you connected with us, right? And that we can share. Again, thank you so much. Please hand in your surveys and donations if you have cash or the slips outside. And I see you'll probably be hanging around with the South people. All right, thank you so much again.
Thank you all for joining us in Nico from Unicorn Riot. We're going to take the stream down. If you want to know more about surveillance in the Muslim community, check out unicornriot.ninja. Go to Unicorn Riot and CVE. CVE is Countering Violent Extremism. Also check out CARE, which is a coalition American Islamic Relations. Check out the Justice Coalition. Check out the Muslim League. Check out Young Muslim Collective. All for information regarding surveillance around the Muslim community here in Minneapolis, as well as worldwide, or even nationwide. The film we just watched was not streamed, but you can find it and watch it. It's called The Feeling of Being Watched. The author was here speaking, giving a Q&A at the end, so thank you all for joining. We're going to take the stream down, and again, continue to follow us if you like our media. Check out unicornriot.ninja, go to support our work, and give what you can. We have a lot of new stuff coming up this summer. We have a team going to Europe shortly. We have some extra specials from Greece coming back out. We got some specials from here on the surveillance that's going on in the community, as well as some things from Denver and beyond. So thank you all for tuning. Again, it's Nico from Unicorn Riot. Have a great weekend.